Claire Evans held the phone between her shoulder and cheek while trying to open a jar of baby food. On the other end of the line, the makeshift babysitter, her neighbor, a kind but impatient retired woman, was already complaining. "They won't stop crying, Claire. You said they'd be asleep," the woman hissed, while in the background, the wailing of the twins filled the tiny apartment. Claire sighed, massaging her temple. I know. They don't have an easy routine. Just give me a few more hours, I'm almost done at work." "Hours?" "Claire." The woman muttered something else before hanging up. Claire bit her lip, looking around her cubicle at Hayes International, one of New York's largest financial conglomerates. Her life revolved around the stacks of paperwork she organized for her boss and the mess of diapers and baby bottles at home. She loved her children. But raising 2-year-old twins alone in New York, with rent increasing at every lease renewal, was not something just anyone could handle without breaking. And now, maybe, she was about to lose her job. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away the panic before it took over. Working as the secretary for Daniel Hayes, one of the most influential men in the financial sector, wasn't easy, but it was what kept food on the table. If she lost this job, she had no idea what she would do. "You're overreacting," she tried to convince herself, but the uneasiness had already settled in, and to make things worse, her boss was calling. "Claire?" Daniel's firm voice came through the phone on her desk. She straightened her posture immediately, grabbed her notepad, and answered. "Yes, sir?" "I need the second quarter performance reports. And coffee. Strong." 1 minute, she hung up and took a deep breath. She had to stay calm. She stood up, grabbed the papers, and, on the way, stopped by the coffee machine. But her mind remained restless. If she really was about to be fired, what could she do to prevent it? She couldn't lose this job. And deep down, an idea started to form. An idea she knew was risky, but in that moment of desperation, it seemed like the only option. Claire left Daniel's office and walked quickly down the hallway toward the company's break room. Coffee was essential for a CEO's routine, someone who barely had time to breathe between meetings, and she had made that trip so many times that she could do it on autopilot. But as she passed the women's restroom, something caught her attention. 2 muffled voices came from inside, speaking in a conspiratorial tone. "I heard he's going to cut someone from the executive team." "Really? But he likes her." Claire stopped in the middle of the hallway. Her heart jumped uncomfortably. He's going to cut someone from the executive team. But he likes her. Her brain put the pieces together immediately, and a chill ran down her spine. They were talking about her. She swallowed hard and took a step back, hiding slightly behind the wall. It couldn't be a coincidence. If Daniel had to let someone go due to budget cuts, it made sense that it would be her. She wasn't essential to the company, just a secretary. And yes, they worked well together, but business was business. Well, that's how things work around here, right? He may like her, but at the end of the day, if she's not useful enough, totally. "I bet we'll have news by Friday." Claire's stomach turned. By Friday? That meant she had, 3 days? She stepped away, her hands shaking. She needed to think. She needed to find a way to make herself indispensable. If Daniel liked her but was still willing to fire her, then maybe she needed something more than just being a good employee. And that was when the absurd and completely wrong idea started to take shape in her mind. She had never thought about it before. Never. She had always been professional, dedicated, serious. But when she looked around the company, she saw so many women moving up the career ladder in ways that were unconventional. Daniel was a charming, powerful, millionaire man. Any woman in the company would throw themselves at him if they had the chance. But Claire had never been one of them. She had always respected the fact that he was married. But what if, just this once, she needed to play the game? Her job depended on it. Her children depended on it. Claire spent the rest of the afternoon trying to keep her composure. But it was impossible. Every time she looked at Daniel, sitting behind his elegant oak desk, analyzing reports with that serious, focused expression, her mind repeated the same phrase like a broken record. "He's going to fire me." She had never thought of herself as someone vulnerable in the company. She always did her job well, was always available, always reliable. But if what those women said was true, then none of that mattered. Daniel was quiet that afternoon, quieter than usual. Was that a bad sign, Claire? His voice interrupted her thoughts, making her jump slightly in her chair. She quickly looked up, straightening her posture. Yes, sir? He stared at her for a second before sliding a folder across the desk. I need you to review these contracts before my meeting tomorrow morning. If you find anything out of place, let me know before 7. Of course. She took the folder and stood up, feeling his gaze linger on her for a brief moment before he returned to his laptop. Claire left the office, but her mind was in chaos. Until Friday. The clock was ticking. She glanced at her reflection in the hallway glass. Her face looked tired, her makeup slightly faded, her hair pulled into a functional bun. Her clothes were modest, professional, but nothing eye-catching. She was invisible. She always had been. And what if she needed to be seen? Her heart pounded at the thought. Something inside her screamed that this was wrong, that it was absurd to even consider. But another part, the part terrified of not knowing how she would feed her children next month, insisted that maybe there was no other option. If some women secured stability in the company by capturing Daniel's attention, why couldn't she try? She took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to change the rules of the game. The next morning, Claire deliberately arrived a few minutes late. She never did that. She was always punctual, professional, predictable. But if she wanted Daniel to notice her in a different way, she needed to shift the dynamic between them. When she finally walked into the office, he was already at his desk, reading emails. Overslept? He remarked without looking up, his voice firm but not irritated. Claire smiled a little more than necessary, as if she were flirting without words. Let's just say I needed a few extra minutes to get ready today. Her voice came out softer than usual. Daniel finally looked up, and Claire knew he noticed. She was different. Her hair, which she always wore up, was now loose in soft waves. Her makeup was more polished, making her green eyes stand out. The silk blouse she chose was more fitted, and the high heels gave her walk an elegance that replaced her usual rushed posture, always moving back and forth between her desk and his office. Daniel said nothing for a moment. He simply observed. Then, he looked back at his screen. All right, I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Any important messages? She had to suppress her frustration. No comment? No lingering look? But before she could let herself get annoyed, she noticed something. The way he ran his hand over his chin while reading emails, small, subtle. But it was there. He noticed. The plan was working. No messages, she replied, picking up her planner and leaning slightly over the desk, as if showing more interest. But I can grab you a coffee before your meeting. Daniel looked at her again, this time more attentively. Sure, strong, no sugar, as always. She smiled, grabbed a notepad, and walked out. Her heart was racing. It was a first step, a test. And for the first time, Claire felt that maybe she could actually make this work. She just had no idea what she was about to set in motion. Claire held the coffee cup firmly as she walked back to Daniel's office. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to maintain composure. If she wanted to be noticed, she couldn't look nervous. When she entered, Daniel was still focused on his laptop, typing quickly. Your coffee, sir. Her voice came out smooth, almost melodic. She approached slowly, setting the cup down on his desk with a light, almost sensual touch. Instead of stepping back immediately, she lingered, standing beside him. Daniel looked up for a brief second. Thank you, Claire. She smiled in a way she had never smiled at him before. You're welcome. And then, as if it were an insignificant detail, she reached out and adjusted his tie, pulling the knot slightly to straighten it. It was a quick movement, but calculated. Daniel froze. He didn't pull away, but he didn't react either. He simply watched her, his eyes slightly narrowed, as if trying to figure something out. She could feel the tension in the air. For a moment, Claire thought he was going to say something, but instead, he blinked, looked away, and picked up his coffee. I have a meeting now. We'll talk about the reports later. He was brushing it off. She swallowed hard and stepped back. Of course, she left the office feeling a mix of frustration and relief. He noticed, but he didn't respond. Still, there was something different in his gaze. He had seen the change, and that was a start. The next day, Claire looked at herself in the mirror before leaving home. She hesitated. The dress she had chosen was slightly more fitted than usual. It wasn't inappropriate, not at all, but it had a cut that flattered her body more noticeably. Her heels were a little higher than the ones she usually wore. Her lipstick, a shade bolder. It wasn't too much, just different. She sighed. Would it be enough for him to notice? On the subway, her mind was a whirlwind. What she was doing didn't feel natural to her. But the alternative, getting fired and having no way to support her children, was worse. When she arrived at the office, she grabbed a coffee and walked to her desk, feeling eyes on her. She didn't know if they were real or just her own nerves. But when she walked past the glass doors of Daniel's office and stepped inside, she knew it had worked. He looked up and paused for a second. It was quick, almost imperceptible. But she saw it. His gaze scanned her face, then her body, and then he went back to his screen as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said, as if nothing was different. Daniel picked up the pen from his desk and twirled it between his fingers. "Good morning." His voice was neutral, professional. But Claire noticed. He took a second too long to respond. He noticed. And for now, that was all she needed. The day went on as usual, or at least that's what Claire tried to convince herself. But she could tell. Daniel was different. It wasn't something obvious, but the small details gave him away. During a meeting with the directors, he seemed less focused. A few times when she spoke, he looked at her a second longer before answering. And then, there was a moment that confirmed it. In the middle of the afternoon, Claire walked into his office to drop off some documents. He was on the phone discussing investments, but when she approached, his eyes shifted instinctively. He kept talking, but Claire saw it. His gaze flicked, briefly but undeniably, down to her legs before returning to the report in front of him. It was quick, almost insignificant, but it happened. She felt a chill in her stomach. It didn't mean he was interested, but it did mean he had noticed, and that meant she was on the right track. Claire smiled to herself as she left the office, feeling a rush of adrenaline. This was only the beginning. Claire spent the rest of the day refining her new approach. She knew Daniel was a practical man, used to direct and objective interactions. So if she really wanted him to notice her, she needed to be subtle. Something that wouldn't raise suspicions, but that would get to him. She started slowly. In the afternoon, when he made a dull joke about the economy, instead of just politely smiling, Claire let out a soft, lingering laugh. A little longer than necessary. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Later, when handing him a report, she let her hand briefly brush against his. It was a minimal, almost accidental touch, but she noticed how he froze for a fraction of a second before continuing as if nothing had happened. And then, at the end of the workday, as he was putting on his coat to leave, Claire seized the moment. "Mr. Hayes?" Daniel paused in the middle of adjusting his sleeve. "Yes," she tilted her head slightly and smiled. "I just wanted to say, I really admire how you handle all of this. Running such a huge company, always focused, always confident. Powerful men are fascinating." The silence that followed was short but charged with something Claire couldn't define. Then, Daniel let out a low chuckle and finished adjusting his coat. "It's part of the job. Good night, Claire." He walked out before she could say anything else. Claire stood there, biting her lip lightly. He didn't react the way she expected, but something inside her told her he was starting to notice. The next day, an opportunity appeared. That night, a corporate event was scheduled, a business dinner with important investors. Claire had never been invited to such occasions. After all, secretaries weren't normally included in these exclusive gatherings. But that afternoon, as Daniel was getting ready to leave the office, Claire took her chance. "Mr. Hayes, do you need assistance at the event tonight? I could help with schedules, guest reception." Daniel hesitated for a moment. She had never shown interest in these events before. "You want to go?" Claire smiled. "Only if you think I'd be useful." He studied her for a second before giving a slow nod. "All right. Meet me at the ballroom at 7. Claire held back her excitement and simply nodded in a professional manner. But as soon as he left, her heart pounded. This was her chance. If she wanted Daniel to see her differently, this dinner was the perfect setting. Claire spent hours getting ready. She chose an elegant black dress, tight just enough, with a discreet yet strategic neckline. The high heels elongated her legs, and her makeup enhanced her features without looking overdone. When she arrived at the hotel ballroom where the event was being held, the looks came immediately. She had always been invisible, but tonight she wasn't. And then she found Daniel. He was standing beside a group of investors, a whiskey glass in hand, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. At first, he didn't see her, but when he did, Claire knew she had done it right. He stopped mid-conversation. It was brief, a minimal lapse of time, but she saw it. She saw his eyes travel over her, from head to toe. She saw how he gripped his glass just a little tighter. Then, he quickly composed himself and gave a side smirk. "I didn't know you liked this kind of event," he said as she approached. Claire shrugged, picking up a glass of wine from a passing waiter. "I think I'm starting to see the benefits." Daniel studied her for a second longer than necessary before turning to introduce the guests. She smiled, satisfied. The first barrier had been broken. Now, all that remained was to see what would come next. Daniel Hayes did not like distractions. He had spent most of his life building his career with absolute focus, never allowing external factors to pull him off course. His marriage was solid, his company was in constant growth, and he had always known how to separate the personal from the professional. But that morning, when he walked into the office and saw Claire sitting at her desk, something felt different. Over the past few days, he had noticed small changes in her. The way she dressed, the way she spoke to him, the way she looked at him. And after the business dinner last night, there were no more doubts. Claire was trying something. The question was, why? He had never had issues with employees attempting to gain his attention through unconventional means. Some women in the company had tried before, but Claire had never been one of them. She had always been reserved, professional, direct. Until now. Daniel ran a hand over his chin, watching her as she picked up some papers. She was testing boundaries. He could feel it. But what was motivating her? He picked up the phone and pressed the button. "Claire, in my office." Through the glass she looked up and nodded before standing and walking toward him. When she entered, he closed his laptop and interlocked his fingers on the desk. "You're different." She blinked, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You know exactly what I mean." A small silence followed. Claire held his gaze, but he noticed a slight tremor in her fingers as she gripped her notepad. Then she smiled. "I think I'm just trying to stand out more at work. I want to make sure I continue being valued here." Daniel observed her for a moment before responding. "Claire, you have always been valued." She didn't say anything. She just kept that same calm, unreadable smile. And in that moment he realized there was something she wasn't telling him. Daniel didn't bring up the conversation again for the rest of the day, but he kept his eyes on her. And then, in the late afternoon, something unexpected happened. When he returned from a meeting, he found a small package on his desk, a rectangular box, elegantly wrapped in dark paper, no sender. He frowned, unwrapped it, and pulled out the contents. A navy blue silk tie, luxurious, expensive. Daniel ran his fingers over the fabric and let out a slow sigh. There was only one person who could have left it there. He picked up the phone and pressed the button. "Claire, in my office." Now, less than a minute later, she appeared in the doorway. "Is something wrong, sir?" He held up the tie. "Was this you?" She hesitated for a second before giving a small smile. "I thought it would look good on you." Daniel tossed the tie onto the desk. "Claire, what are you doing?" She blinked, still playing innocent. "I'm just being thoughtful." He leaned back in his chair, watching her in silence. "You've never done anything like this before." Claire let out a soft laugh. "Maybe I'm just learning to appreciate certain people more." Daniel felt the tension in the air grow. She wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. He studied her for a long moment before picking up the tie and placing it back in the box. "I appreciate the gift," he said, his voice controlled. "But I prefer to choose my own ties." Claire nodded slowly, without losing her smile. "Understood." She turned and walked out of the office. Daniel watched the door close, feeling a weight settle in his chest. Something was wrong, and he needed to figure out what it was. He knew Claire had always been extremely respectful of his relationship. The next day, Claire intensified her strategy. If Daniel was hesitant, then she needed to push harder. She started casually appearing in the same places as him. At the building's cafe, for example, where he always got his coffee at the same time every day. When he arrived, she was already there, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. Mr. Hayes, she said, smiling as she saw him. Daniel hesitated for a second before returning the greeting. Claire? She feigned surprise. Do you always come here at this time? I never noticed. He raised an eyebrow. You've worked with me for years. She laughed. I guess I never paid enough attention. She ordered a cappuccino, casually tucking her hair behind her ear, an innocent-looking gesture, but completely calculated. Daniel glanced at her briefly but said nothing. Later, when leaving the office, it happened again. He was stepping into the elevator when Claire slipped in at the last second. Almost missed it, she said, slightly breathless, smiling. Daniel just nodded. She leaned against the wall, watching him from the corner of her eye. He was noticing. But he still wasn't giving in. Later that day, Claire made her boldest move. She walked into his office with a report, but instead of handing it over and leaving, she lingered. She stood there for a moment, just watching him. Do you need anything else? He asked, not looking up. She hesitated, then stepped closer and placed both hands on his desk. I've been thinking about something we talked about before. Daniel finally looked up. What? Claire wet her lips, her heartbeat quickening. About how some connections can be valuable in the workplace. How certain partnerships can help maintain job security. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of partnerships? Claire held his gaze. The right ones, with the right people. The silence between them was heavy. Daniel didn't speak for a long moment. He just watched her. Then he let out a slow sigh and closed the report calmly. Claire, I really hope you're not saying what I think you are. Her stomach twisted. But before she could respond, he continued. Because if you are, we're going to have a problem. Claire opened her mouth but no words came out. At that moment she realized Daniel knew exactly what was happening, and now she had gone too far. Claire felt her heart pound. Daniel stared at her with a serious expression, without a trace of humor. She needed to get out of this situation without looking desperate. Forcing a small smile, she leaned back slightly in her chair. I don't know what you mean, sir. He didn't look away. You don't? His tone was controlled, but there was something in the way he studied her that sent a chill down her spine. Claire let out a soft laugh. I think you're misinterpreting. I only meant that it's important to have good connections at work. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be analyzing her. Then he reached for the navy blue tie Claire had given him a few days before. Slowly he folded it and set it aside. Claire, he finally said, how long have we worked together? She swallowed hard. Almost 4 years. And in all that time you've always been extremely professional. You've always respected your position, always understood how to keep very clear boundaries. He crossed his hands on the desk. But suddenly, that changed. Claire looked away but forced herself to remain calm. People evolve, she said with a soft smile. Maybe I just realized I was holding myself back too much. Daniel let out a slow sigh. Or maybe there's something else going on. The silence stretched. He was waiting for her to speak, but Claire couldn't tell the truth. So she simply smiled, stood up, and picked up her notepad. Well, if you need anything else, I'll be at my desk. She turned to leave, but just before reaching the door, Daniel said something that made her freeze. Claire? She stopped. Yes? He paused before answering, and when he did, his voice was firm but not aggressive. Whatever is going on, be careful. Claire didn't respond. She just walked out of the office, feeling the ground beneath her feet become a little less steady. That conversation should have been a warning for Claire to stop, but instead, it only made her realize something even more unsettling. Daniel hadn't pushed her away completely. Yes, he had given her a warning, but he hadn't fired her. He hadn't openly confronted her. Did that mean there was still a chance? She needed to test it. By the end of the day, she waited for the perfect moment. When she saw Daniel leaving the building to catch a cab, Claire hurried and caught up to him on the sidewalk. Mr. Hayes, she called, making him turn around. Daniel looked tired. Yes, she smiled casually and held up a small envelope in her hand. I was going to leave this on your desk, but since I saw you were leaving. She handed him the envelope. Daniel took it and frowned when he saw the name of a restaurant printed on the card. What is this? A restaurant suggestion. Claire tilted her head slightly. I know your wife is traveling this week, and I thought you might like to check this place out. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Did you look into my personal schedule? She chuckled softly. I didn't have to. The receptionist mentioned that your wife was in Boston for a conference. Daniel looked at the envelope and then at her. Claire held her posture, watching for any sign of hesitation. If he gave even the smallest opening, it would mean he was wavering. But then Daniel gave her a small smirk. It wasn't a smirk of interest. It was the smirk of a man who understood exactly what was happening. He handed the envelope back to her. I appreciate the suggestion, but I don't have dinner with employees. Claire froze for a second. The rejection was clear. Definitive. Daniel stepped toward the curb, signaling for a taxi. Before getting into the car, he looked at her one last time. Claire had misunderstood everything the entire time. Her heart raced. She tried to appear normal, nodded, and stepped away. But her mind was in chaos. What the hell have I done? She had lowered herself, thrown away her professionalism, put herself in a humiliating situation. Over a false rumor. She sank into her chair, running her hands over her face. And now? Claire was still processing the information when she found herself back in the break room, staring at the coffee machine without really seeing it. She had been ridiculous. She had interpreted everything wrong. She had put herself in a humiliating position, lost control, and now Daniel definitely knew something was off. She needed to act normal. She needed to pretend nothing had happened. But then, the same two coworkers who had spread the rumor appeared beside her, laughing about something. Poor Jason, one of them said, pouring herself coffee. But it makes sense. He hadn't been delivering results for months. Yeah, and the best part, the other one chuckled, is that yesterday he even tried to schedule a dinner with Daniel to plead his case, but the boss didn't even give him the chance. Said company decisions aren't based on feelings. Claire felt the words hit her like a punch in the stomach. Company decisions aren't based on feelings. So Daniel had never hesitated about firing someone for business reasons. If she had really been on the list, he would have done it. No games, no hesitation. And she had spent days trying to seduce a married man for no reason. She felt her stomach churn. What must Daniel be thinking of her now? Had he already figured out exactly what she'd been trying to do? Claire? She blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. The two women were staring at her. Are you okay? You look a little pale. Claire forced a smile and grabbed her coffee, trying to act normal. Just work stress, she replied, not leaving room for more questions. They shrugged and went back to their conversation. But now that she knew the truth, only one question remained. What did Daniel think of her now? The day passed in a blur. Claire tried to focus on work, but her hands trembled every time she typed an email. She was afraid. Over the last few days, she had completely lost control. She had acted in ways that went against everything she believed was right. Fear had consumed her. 2 babies to raise. She had been vulnerable. And now, how could she fix it? Maybe an honest conversation? No. Admitting everything would be a disaster. Maybe she should just go back to acting normal? Pretend none of it ever happened? Every scenario she imagined was worse than the last. And then, before she could reach any conclusion, Daniel's deep voice sounded behind her. Claire. She froze. Slowly, she turned around and saw him standing in his office doorway. He had already returned from his meeting. In my office, now. Claire felt her legs lock for a second. She thought she was going to be fired, but not for her performance, not because of the rumor, but for her inappropriate behavior and the mistakes she had made. But she had no choice. She swallowed hard, grabbed her notepad, and stepped into his office, her heart pounding so loudly it echoed in her ears. She had put herself in this situation. Now, she needed to figure out how to get out of it. As she stepped into the office, Daniel picked up an envelope and extended it to her. Claire, startled, asked, "What is this? Your new salary?" Claire blinked, shocked. "My, what?" Daniel gave her a small smirk. "You were never on the list of layoffs. In fact, we were discussing a raise for you before all of this happened." He leaned back slightly. "And I know you overheard the wrong rumor. You panicked and started acting out of character." Claire felt a shock course through her body. She was never at risk. Everything she had done over the past few days had been completely unnecessary. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. I don't know what to say." Daniel simply gave her a small nod. "You can start with thank you." Claire let out a small, nervous laugh. "Thank you." Daniel nodded again. Have a good evening, Claire. She left the office with a lighter heart than she had felt in days. She had made mistakes. She had humiliated herself, but in the end, the truth had won, and in some way, this was a fresh start.
What did you think of the story? Would you have acted differently than Claire? And what about Daniel's stance? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to follow us for more stories. Thank you.